First things first, I want you to take a look at the difference between these two books. My book, Pink Face, and R.F. Kuang's book, Yellowface. Let's start off with these differences.
I said, your wife, Karen Randall.
I just lost my live stream because someone reported me for hate speech. You can't make this up. You can't.
My name's Jordan Randall, and this is how my book did the thing. There's a lot to the story, so I'll leave timestamps in the description, but here are a few chapters. Context: my life at the time, my inspiration for writing, my writing process, etc. Second, my decision to release independently. Third, the release itself and the public's reaction. 4, my ongoing discrimination case with Busboys and Poets. 5, Yellowface with R.F. Kuang. And my conclusion. So to not bore you any further, let's get right into it. So my music career was on life support after a failed marketing campaign for my song Spring-Loaded Locks, and I was thousands of dollars in debt, and my mother had just gotten cancer. I had always intended on writing my book Pink Face, but down the line as a more established artist because I knew on some level I'd face this. But if I had a platform already, I'd have an opportunity to address the issues brought up in my book without having an angry mob dictate truth. But what is Pink Face about? Pink Face is a book about the bargaining phase of grief of the end of white supremacy told through a false messiah narrative. Essentially, a high school senior gets into his head that the world is no longer built for straight white people anymore, so to stand out on his college applications, he pretends to transition into a woman. Without going to any major spoilers, here are a select few themes that directly correlate with what I'm going through right now. The way dishonest white liberal people use minorities to get ahead in life. 2, the unconscious racism said white liberal people have towards black people whenever they discuss the LGBTQ community. 3, how minorities get censored for stating things like this. 4, the preference that white liberal people place on minority populations like the LGBTQ community because they're white versus just the black community and how they pit each other against each other. And the last one, being offended is about power. So a quick explanation for this. So if I were to get called the N-word by a white person that I knew, and I were to ask that person to not call me the N-word anymore, in that sense, I'm taking power in that situation to tell them what they can and cannot say simply because I'm offended. This is a good thing. The question is, how much does this get stressed, and whether or not it's honest offense or if it's seeking power? Kind of explains a lot of online discourse, I know. Anyway, themes aside, after doing some prep work, character bios, outlining, etc., I sat down to write my book, and I wrote it in 23 days, averaging about 3,300 words per day. As someone with ADHD, I brought a blue-collar work ethic where I would literally clock in and clock out of me sitting down to write my book. Editing took longer, but the first draft was indeed done in 23 days. I've always struggled with reading, so I wrote with a very minimalist writing style. If there are words on the page, they absolutely need to be there. No more, no less. Anyway, now that the context is there, let's get to the next part of the story. My publishing industry woes. So to get traditionally published, before you can go to a publishing house, you need to go through a literary agent. The literary agent takes your manuscripts and shops it to a bunch of different publishing houses, and you get published, and the publishing house deals with distribution. My issue is getting past that first stage of getting a literary agent. I queried over 100 different literary agents, and man, it was by far the most uncomfortable thing I've done in my entire life. When I looked over literary agents, I could only find 3 that were black, and none of them were in very high places. The overwhelming majority of them were white, and man, some of the descriptions that these people wrote, dude, looking for BIPOC / Latinx authors as well. I can't do it. I had to look up what BIPOC meant. BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, Person of Color. This immediately set off red flags in my head about what the publishing industry represents. I don't know of a single black person or a single Latino that prefers being called BIPOC or Latinx. I would genuinely rather be called the N-word over BIPOC. I know it's funny, but listen to what I'm saying. If a white person insists on calling us BIPOC, that means that they don't listen to black people. If someone calls us the N-word, at the very least they can say, hey, you guys call each other this. What's wrong with me saying it? But when you call a black person BIPOC, you're doing a few things. First, you're telling me that you learned about black people through a college classroom, not through experience. Second, that means that you group a bunch of minorities that have nothing to do with each other under one umbrella as non-white. 3, in this case, it means that you want a black face and not a black voice, because a black voice would tell you, do not ever call anyone BIPOC. Let's look at some facts here. Black culture is the only culture out there that creates billionaires. Jay-Z, Dr. Dre, Oprah Winfrey, Kanye West. Culture created that wealth. When you look at the figures, black people account for about 13% of the population, yet 37% of Billboard Hot 100 hits. So in publishing, you'd expect black people to occupy about 13% of published authors, right? Possibly a little bit more because there's that wealth opportunity. Actually, black authors account for under 6% of all published authors. What about another minority? Let's look at the LGBTQ community. They're about 7% of the population, yet about 16% of all published authors out there are LGBTQ. Before I go any further, this is a good thing. It is very clear that LGBTQ people are going through a struggle for their civil rights, and it is a good thing that we're getting more diverse voices out there telling their stories. While diversity comes with its issues, diversity is ultimately a source of strength, and it is a good thing that we're telling more diverse stories. We've come a long way since Brokeback Mountain being the only representation of gay people in the media. But double the representation of the LGBTQ community versus less than half of the representation of black people and published authors raises a lot of questions about bias. Needless to say, out of the over 100 literary agents that I queried, none of them thought this idea would sell. I guess the idea of a white person pretending to be a minority to get ahead in life isn't an idea that people would think would sell books. That's foreshadowing right there. So instead of traditionally publishing, I self-published. Look at that cover. Isn't it clean? So the release, and wow, I got some responses. I mean, wow. Before I go into all that, I need to be grateful for what I do have. My friends and family have generally been incredibly supportive of me. I think a lot of the times it's so easy to get wrapped up in the negative that you forget that you have a lot of good things going on. So for those who have supported my book, thank you. In case you're wondering from that, yeah, I got a torrent of hate sent my way. I got called racist, I got called bigoted, and I got called a transphobe. I got my personal number leaked and a bunch of random people started calling me to harass me about my book. Keep in mind, this was a day after I released the book. The only people who had actually read my book were editors and a few early readers. All people saw was the cover. No one had any time to actually read my book, but I had people already openly calling to review bomb my work. I made a theme in my book, the anxiety that white liberal people have towards black people whenever they mention the term trans. And I was proven right. I stated out loud to people that I thought had my best interests at heart that a lot of this was due to the color of my skin, but then they responded back by saying, quote, "I don't think it has anything to do with race in my opinion." Keep in mind, once again, this is before anyone had the chance to actually read my book. One thing I learned was how foolish I was to allow other people to change the way that I thought about my own circumstances. If you take anything away from this video, take this. Do not take advice from anyone you disagree with that are not held accountable for their words. You will end up making their mistakes for them. Listen to people with relevant experience that you would go to for advice, and listen to people who are tied to your success. The worst feeling is following someone else's path while ignoring your own compass. I'm mixed race. I have a white psychology and I have a black psychology. My black side was telling me that the prejudice that I was facing and to the degree that I was facing it was because of my race, and my white side was going with the plausible deniability. I allowed other people to change my perspective, and I feel really dumb for getting gaslit. Anyway, I don't want to go too much into the harassment. If I were to, it would take hours, so just take a look at some of these comments. Pause if you want to read each one individually. Here's a video of my father and I getting harassed.
You dude, you came over and you started yelling at me in the parking lot.
My mother.
Transphobic.
You said my mother over a book that you haven't read.
Here's that person calling me and my parents pieces of
No, you're a piece of
Name one character.
Transphobic son's a piece
Name
of
one character, Jake, making a massive accusation about my work.
But
I have a lot of examples, but you get the gist. Oh, and while all this harassment was going on, I was getting a review bombed. Look at my Goodreads score. Lower than Mein Kampf, the book that my book often gets compared to. Before I go further, I need to make this clear. My book is not bigoted, my book is not transphobic, and my book is not racist. It actually calls out bigotry, transphobia, and racism by name. It's one thing for you to accuse my book of being transphobic or bigoted or racist without having read it. That's just prejudice committing itself to ignorance and turning into action. That's expected. What I didn't expect was that when readers would find zero evidence supporting the idea that my book is racist or transphobic or bigoted, instead of admitting that they were wrong and that they found evidence to the contrary, they'd accuse me of transphobia anyway so they could feel like a good person. This is disgusting. I don't call these people Karens. Karen is far too high of a compliment. I call these people Carolins. That level of dishonesty is unbelievably harmful, and if you actually read the book, you'd see exactly how harmful it is. Not to mention the fact that if you actually read my book, there's a chapter where I call out this behavior verbatim. The damage that you can do of riling up an angry mob by accusing someone of transphobia that you know is not being transphobic, literally word for word in my book. Anyway, I put together a small event for my book and used my social media to go live, and this is how that went.
I just lost my live stream because someone reported me for hate speech.
Yeah, reported for hate speech, and I couldn't go live anymore. So to address the book and the controversy surrounding it, I contacted the bookstore/restaurant called Busboys and Poets that I used to go to. Keyword, used to. Quick background info. I was born and raised in Columbia, Maryland. Columbia was built in the 60s by James Rouse to create a community that did not have a history of redlining, and it was a planned community. This community ended up being highly integrated. My mother is black and my father is white, and in the 1980s when they met, no one looked at them twice. Being mixed race, that concept right there means a lot to me. Busboys and Poets came to Columbia a few years ago at the welcome of the county executive. The owner of Busboys and Poets stated that Columbia, quote, embraces his form of diversity, and that it, quote, speaks to the same values as Busboys and Poets. More foreshadowing. Being that it's a bookstore/restaurant that purchased a bunch of things to show that they support inclusion and equality, and that they purchased a bunch of things to show that they support Black Lives Matter and trans rights, I contacted them about hosting an author event. I mean, just look at this spot. It looks like it was designed by a Howard University grad. So when I emailed them about hosting an event for my book, at first they were ecstatic, and so they sent over a contract that I signed that would have my book sold in their stores and lock in a date for my book event. Then, as part of the promotional material, they asked for me to send out my headshot. As soon as they saw my headshot and saw that I was black, next, they canceled my event stating that we, quote, disagree with each other on values. So logically, I followed up by asking them what values were those specifically. Then they followed up by saying that it wasn't the values that we disagreed with, but it was the manner in which I expressed those values in my book that they disagreed with. Once again, I asked for specifics, and then they told me that that was all they were able to tell me. Now listen, if you've got a contract with someone, and they haven't seen your face, and then they see your face, and then they cancel that contract, and they start talking about excuses without anything to back it up at all, that means something that they saw, they didn't like. So I asked them straight up, is this a race thing? And this is how they responded. Thank you for emailing us. We are not accepting your book for a multitude of reasons. The primary one being it is a book written about a marginalized experience that the author does not identify with. Pause. That right there, that is discrimination, which is illegal. Businesses have the right to deny service, but not based off of immutable characteristics like your country of origin, your religion, your sexuality, your gender, or your race. Unpause. It does not have to do with the fact that you're a black author. Keep this in mind. We would react the very same to a white author if they wrote Pink Face or any other similar situation. Important, keep that in mind. For example, let's say this book was about a white teenage boy masquerading as a black man in the admission process for undergraduate. Even if he has inspired other biracial or black kids to stand up in their racial identity and lived experiences, this is not something we would condone or support as a bookstore and would not be a book we would carry. Highly important. Remember this right here. You can read more of the email at the bottom if you'd like to, but this needs more context and it'll come up later. Obviously, I was disgusted. They canceled my event and openly cited the fact that I'm cisgender as the primary reason why they canceled my event. Not to mention, go talk to a lawyer. They openly admitted that they discriminated. So at the advice of my lawyer friends, I got in contact with the Maryland Commission on Civil Rights and I filed a discrimination case. To remedy the situation, all I wanted was a public apology and for them to reinstate my event. I didn't ask for a dime. You know, funny enough, I was on the phone with the person at intake with the Maryland Commission on Civil Rights, and I told them my situation. I read to them the emails. Immediately after I read them to him, he said, so it's because your race and your gender. And my dumbass said, I don't think my race has anything to do with it, actually. He paused for a second, and he said, I'm going to put down your race anyway. You need to be a better advocate for yourself. I left that meeting thinking, all right, well, I guess so, but I don't know if it has anything to do with my race. During this whole case, I was thoroughly convinced that the only reason why they had canceled my event was because I was cisgender, and I went to the internet and I started talking about it. To the internet's credit, without anyone reading the emails, I had countless people openly call me a liar. They openly called me a liar and said that my book was transphobic and that a socially conscious bookstore was just doing the right thing in canceling my event. None of these people had actually read my book, but what they saw was Carolyn's telling people that my book was racist, transphobic, and bigoted. I'm serious, man. I could go over every single comment, but just imagine, it was in the hundreds. But one of the most important things happened. I posted about that situation on my Facebook, and one of my Facebook friends asked me, so what do you think they would have thought about Yellowface? I need to remind you, I don't read very often. I've always struggled with reading. But a book called Yellowface, that is eerily similar to the name of my book, Pink Face. So I looked it up. Briefly, it's a story about a white woman who pretends to be Chinese and steals her friend, who's actually Chinese's manuscript after she dies. The book explores themes such as socioeconomic status, appropriation of identity, all while a main character reaps undeserved rewards because she pretends to be someone who she's not. Really unlikable main character. Similar to how my book explores those exact same things through my character, Alfred Hall. Then everything made sense. Yellowface is a book about a white woman who pretends to be Chinese to get ahead in life, and my book is about a white man who pretends to be trans to get ahead in life. Let's take a look back at what Busboys and Poets said. It is a book written about a marginalized experience that the author does not identify with. It does not have to do with the fact that you are a black author. We would react the very same to a white author if they wrote Pink Face or any other similar situation. Any other similar situation. I looked it up. Busboys and Poets sells Yellowface. This is insane. I need to reiterate. They said they would react the very same to a white author if they wrote Pink Face or any other similar situation. Similar situation. Meanwhile, Yellowface is sold in their stores? So now at this point, I decided to look a little bit more into their catalog. Guess what? They sell To Kill a Mockingbird. To Kill a Mockingbird was written by Harper Lee, who is a white woman writing about a marginalized experience that she doesn't identify with. I'm getting really mad saying this out loud once again. I mean, the insanity of what they said. They took one look at me and assumed that it couldn't be transgender. Which, let me ask you this, how can you determine whether or not someone is trans by just looking at a photo of them? Isn't that transphobic that you would take a look at one photo of me and determine that there was no way possible that I could be transgender? Or does it come back to exactly what the person at the Maryland Commission on Civil Rights told me, and multiple people have been trying to tell me this entire time? It's because I am black. I had my event signed, they said they were excited to have me, then I sent out my headshot, and then they canceled my event as soon as they saw my skin color. The only reason why there's any debate here is because Busboys and Poets looks like a progressive bookstore because they bought a bunch of stuff. Keep in mind, after I asked them if they canceled my event because of my race, the first thing that they had to start talking about was my identity. Take any other bookstore and there would be zero question that this was discrimination. That image that they have is the exact problem that I'm talking about. I state exactly what happened. Then people contact Busboys and Poets for comment, and then Busboys and Poets reports back to them that they canceled my event because we, quote, disagree with each other on values. But let's look back at their emails. I myself am non-binary and was immediately put off by a book about a cis-het young white man pretending to be trans. I understand this is a plot device. However, in this political climate where trans people are constantly questioned, under fire, harmed, and even killed by our transphobic society, we do not find this acceptable. Meanwhile, in Yellowface, a white woman pretends to be Chinese. And guess what? Have you heard about all the violence against Asian people since 2020? But yet that concern wasn't enough for them to take Yellowface off their bookshelves? Once again, they're excited to have me. I signed a contract. I had a date set. They asked for my headshot. They saw I was black, and they canceled my event. Look at the cover of my book. The color scheme is literally the trans pride flag. But they made the assumption that my book was transphobic because there's a stereotype out there that black people are transphobic and homophobic. They didn't ask me how I felt about the trans community. They didn't ask me any follow-up questions. They just made their decision and refused to speak with me. Funny enough, it's not just me having issues with the way that Busboys and Poets handles racial issues. It's also Black Lives Matter DC. Here's a quote from one of their spokespeople. The core organizers of Black Lives Matter DC will no longer accept speaking engagements, participate in panels, or otherwise patronize any Busboys and Poets or mule-born restaurants based on our past experiences. This was over the way that they mishandled an attempt to foster a dialogue about race relations in DC. Interesting. Back to the Maryland Commission on Civil Rights. After 5 months, they refused to sit down with me and have a settlement conference, and instead offered me a $20 gift card, along with a letter essentially stating, "We're sorry you're offended." So I did what any other person in my situation would do. I went to the news, and I had a few people who were interested in telling my story. So it was finally my chance to get my side of the story told. Talking to one of the journalists was great. This one in particular, I emailed them, and within 5 minutes of them getting my email, they emailed me back asking to see if I could talk with them over the phone. The conversation we had could have gone on for hours, but essentially they were interested. We were going to do an interview about how my mother's cancer inspired me to write 3,300 words per day at 12 hours a day. How my biracial upbringing affected my outlook on the world. How the narrative about my book was being called racist, transphobic, and bigoted in one review, and in the other commending me for calling out transphobia, bigotry, and racism. They simply stated it like this: I got into journalism to tell stories like this. The powerful need to be held accountable. Then this person had to pitch this story to their editor. Unfortunately, the editor said no to covering the story because they thought it would be too controversial of a story and it might upset their readership. Unfortunately, the other journalists I had talked to had responded back with similar stories. This isn't good. The Fourth Estate isn't being allowed to do their job because they're worried about our culture's worst actors. These journalists want to tell this story because the truth is important. Maybe people would stop calling me a liar for saying nothing but the truth. I didn't do anything to deserve this type of response aside from call out the type of racism that I heard growing up. For all the black people watching, weren't you tired of hearing the N-word pour out of these kids' mouths when you were growing up? Meanwhile, that experience that you and I both went through is just not discussed on television or movies. Every time that there's footage of a white influencer saying the N-word,
what a f***ing jeez.
Everyone acts like it's a big surprise. The truth is, we've been knowing this is going on for decades, yet at the mainstream television or movie level, this just isn't discussed. And now when I try to call out that exact behavior, I'm called racist. Black people, how many of you been in a group with liberal white people and the topic of something racist comes up and a white person becomes the most performatively upset? Doesn't that get under your skin and make you feel a little bit like an other? See, this is the thing that I've been saying. This exact behavior, we all know goes on. We all know it happens in the black community, but it also happens with the LGBTQ community. But in that situation, it's significantly more harmful just based off of representation. Like I've said before, black people are about 13% of the population, so the representation is there, and it's been there for decades. You got the Harlem Renaissance, you got civil rights leaders, you got Black Panther, and you've got hip hop. But what representation do you think the trans community has when they're only 1% of the population? How do you think the average person is introduced to trans issues? It's usually by someone who's not trans themselves turning being offended into a performance so they can gain power in a situation. Is it so unbelievable that the same people calling my book transphobic are the same people calling the police on a black couple for grilling in a park? Here's one of the theses in my book. In the vast majority of the country, racism is no longer socially acceptable. This is a good thing, and it took years. But as we've seen in incidents across the nation, racism appears in the most plausibly deniable ways whenever it comes to a liberal. It was the charcoal grills with Barbecue Becky, and in my case, it's accusations of transphobia. I know what people saw when they saw my book. They saw a book about a high school senior who fakes transitioning to a woman. They saw a black, mixed author, and that was all they needed to see. These people had their minds made up that my book was transphobic, and no matter what the actual contents of my book said to the contrary of that, they had to have their prejudices confirmed. Look at the dichotomy between how my book Pinkface was received and how R.F. Kuang's book Yellowface was received. People assumed that Yellowface was R.F. Kuang's way of expressing her frustrations with white people, yet assumed that my book was transphobic. Maybe Pinkface is my way of bringing attention to issues that the media has been oddly quiet about. Maybe Pinkface is my way of calling out a society that taught me that my black features were ugly. Maybe it's me calling out the same exact things that I heard from my white friends growing up. My first single, Spring Loaded Locks, is all about loving natural hair in opposition to what I grew up hearing, where people would say that the hair that I have on top of my head was pubic hair. Yes, my book has white kids saying the N-word in my book, but believe me, that's them getting off easy. You have no idea the type of racist crap that I heard pouring out of these people's mouths. Trust me, I wish it was just the N-word. Who do you think were the ones really harassing me about my book? Guess what? It wasn't trans people harassing me about my book. It was allies. What about the fact that my book calls out the open secret about how racist some of these kids are, and instead people responded with calling me racist or transphobic? Instead of protecting the trans community, these allies are actually protecting themselves. There are two scenarios that I can see that would drive these Carolines to call my work transphobic in reviews. Either A, they were so blinded by their prejudice that they couldn't think objectively, and instead decided to throw out any bits of information that disproved how they felt, and also made them lie about what they actually read. Or B, you felt called up on my book. You felt called out and you wanted to bury my book under accusations of transphobia and racism because my book calls out your worst behavior. Notice how this entire time I've mentioned very little about the contents of my book? It is absurd to the degree that the contents of my book mirror the exact thing that I'm going through right now. In my book, I have a black character named James. James has nothing to do with the trans community, yet he sticks out his neck to support his friend Alfred, who is actually faking being trans this entire time. James learns that Al had not only harmed an actual trans person in the process of him pretending to transition to a woman, but he had also had this massive blind spot while pretending to have progressive values in his friend Trent, who was shouting racial slurs and making racist jokes. All of them at James's expense. So when James goes to confront Alfred at school about how Alfred had been pretending to be trans this entire time while using him, Trent decides to get involved. Trent, in front of a crowd of people, decides to call James transphobic for calling Alfred a man, even though Trent knew the entire time that Alfred was faking it. Trent then riles up a crowd of people to beat up on James for James telling the truth about Alfred pretending to have these values, pretending to be trans, and for James calling out the fact that Trent was racist. Trent did this to protect his friend from losing the power that Alfred had gained by pretending to be trans, all while masking it in him fighting against transphobia. Just like Busboys and Poets, portrays and profits off of virtue while discriminating behind the scenes. Meanwhile, the image that they purchased protects them from any and all criticism, especially coming from someone like me. Don't believe me? Read my book. Tell me I didn't get this exactly accurate. Tell me I'm not going through this exact behavior that I called out. This was never about protecting the reputation of trans people. It was always about the power of being offended and using minorities to wield that power. If people were actually concerned with supporting trans people, they wouldn't be calling my book transphobic, bigoted, or racist. Do these people understand how they're making the trans community look? I doubt that they know or care. At the end of the day, it's not their community. They get to say whatever they want and go home and not have to deal with the burden. Me, personally, I am tired of seeing this discrimination be wrapped up in the cloak of liberal values. If you remember or not, Get Out was set in upstate New York for a reason. It satirizes white liberalism. You are not exempt from unconscious racism just because you voted blue. Want to have some fun? I uploaded this video into parts on various different social media sources. Guess what the comments are saying right now? Calling me transphobic or mocking me in some other type of fashion? Do you think any of these people actually read my book, or do you think they just saw that I was black? Mixed. They saw my cover and they said, I've seen all I need to see. Remember that scene that I told you about with James, Alfred, and Trent? I based that scene off of a lynching. There's a reason why I've been calling these people who have been calling my book transphobic, bigoted, or racist, Carolines. As in like Carolyn Bryant. As in the woman who falsely accused Emmett Till of wolf whistling at her, which led to his lynching. I'm still alive, but the concept remains. Without any due process, people have deemed my work to be transphobic, and I bet you if you sat someone down, made them watch this entire video, made them read my entire book, they would still more than likely call my book transphobic. These people wouldn't be able to admit that they made a mistake and persecuted someone off of their own ignorance. It's the same reason why that people say that for racism to die out, all you gotta do is wait out the older generation. But to be honest, going down that path, that's making an emotional commitment to ignorance. To the trans community, I see the comments that you receive on social media, and I think it's disgusting, and you receive them just for existing. I was hoping that Pinkface would introduce a small yet empathetic character to a bunch of people who would never read anything about trans people. I'm sorry that you have to deal with people making support for you into a performance. As a black, mixed person, I see that, and I'm sorry that you have to go through it. I can't imagine what it's like to be trans in this country, but I can empathize. I hope the more people that read my book, the more they can see the parallels between what the trans community has gone through and the black community has gone through, and hopefully they'll be a little bit more empathetic. You are human beings, not caricatures. To Busboys and Poets, shame on you for discriminating behind the scenes while profiting off of a black image. Shame on you for refusing to listen to me, shame on you for refusing to sit down with me, and shame on you for misusing the influence that you bought. This is the exact reason why you don't censor people. What you did was not just immoral, but it was also illegal. You can keep your gift card. There is a reason why Black Lives Matter DC doesn't want to have anything to do with you. Do better. To the white people who are liberal, it's not everyone. But don't forget this. There was a study done on racial bias education, and it showed that those with an incomplete racial bias education actually were more emboldened in their racist views. Essentially, I can't be racist, I watched Get Out. The most significant times that I was told that my situation had nothing to do with my race, it was by white people who were in interracial relationships with black people. White people who would be disgusted if anyone told their black significant other that a situation that they were going through had nothing to do with their race. Look, if your heart was in the right place, we're cool. Part of being an American means that we're going to have conversations like this. And to be honest, now you're making a mistake. Down the line, I'm probably going to make a mistake. And I would hope someone would show me some level of empathy and be able to say, you know what? He made a mistake. To those who read my book and called it transphobic, bigoted, or racist, I have nothing to say to you besides do better. I hate that for many of you, this is your introduction to me. And normally I'm a lot more fun of a person. You know, you should see me on the sidelines when my dad and I are coaching kids soccer. But all this needed to be said. There's not a lot in my book that is super controversial. The only reason why it's controversial is because people want it to be controversial. My final thoughts on this video, and man, just wait until I get the opportunity to talk about the actual contents of the book rather than just this situation. Either everything that I'm saying is true and my book accurately assesses some of the issues that our culture goes through, so accurately that I was censored and that I accurately called out exactly what I'd be going through, or this entire video is just a transphobe coping. Your choice. I just want to get back to music, man. I feel like the music space is not nearly as toxic as the book space.